My name is Simon Blythe, and I'm the Education Lead for Fujitsu Consulting in North America. Over the last 6 months, our lives have been dominated by the impact of COVID-19. But today, I'd like to look ahead and see how this pandemic may yet become one of the most compelling events to effect a positive change in our publicly funded education. Today, I'm speaking to you from my home office here in Vancouver, Canada. And like many of you, I've been working at home for the last 6 months, and probably also like many of you, I've been sharing my workspace with my children, one in university and the other one still in high school. Like millions of students the world over, my kids have had to adapt to a completely new learning paradigm as their education institutions shut their doors. Globally, over 1.5 billion students have been directly disrupted. Just here in Canada, the government's lockdown closed every institution virtually overnight, resulting in over 7 million students across Canada literally locked out of their school. The impact on education is unprecedented. There's no other event in history, no natural disaster, no economic crisis, not even world wars, have come close to impacting so many students so completely and so abruptly. So how are we coping, and what does this mean for the future? To provide some context, let's take a step back to where we were before COVID-19. At the beginning of 2020, students were attending classes that weren't that much different to what their parents experienced 30, 40, maybe even 50 years ago. Yes, many institutions had change initiatives underway. But if you look back, two things are really quite striking about the way that those changes were being implemented. First of all, the pace of change was very slow. It's not easy to implement change in this environment. Education is highly valued and it's got its own very strong culture and ethos. That's mostly a strength, but it can also be a barrier. When you have to simultaneously align government policy, institutional leadership, teacher capabilities and parent expectations, it's not difficult to see why change is hard. As a result, introducing technology innovations have been mostly limited to enhancing existing classroom activities, such as leveraging content online, or providing hardware in the classroom such as tablets or laptops or smartboards. But the core accepted method for delivering teaching has remained largely unchallenged. Online learning may be an option, so students can choose between doing a course either online or in a classroom, but it's almost always one or the other. Secondly, the drivers for change have come from within. That may seem natural, but consider how external disruptive innovation has radically reshaped other sectors of our society. Think about how we shop, for example, or where we stay, or how we travel, or even what we watch. The innovation leaders in these sectors were not incumbents. They were new entrants: Amazon, Airbnb, Uber, and Netflix. The existing providers have tried to adapt, but the pace of digital disruption in these sectors has been set by the newcomers. But public education is different. It's a monopoly, and it's tightly controlled and guarded by politicians and educators and taxpayers alike. Before COVID-19, even the most forward-looking institutions were not advocating wholesale changes to the delivery model. The emphasis was more on the policy initiatives, such as moving to core competencies, personalising learning, and implementing new curriculums, rather than restructuring the way that education is delivered. Okay, so now let's look at what happened when COVID-19 hit. Everywhere, the impact on education was immediate, drastic, and urgent. Suddenly, a sector that's been almost completely immune to rapid change was confronted with a scenario where everything changed all at once. Consider that most education establishments have emergency plans and business continuity plans, and yet virtually none of them had foreseen the impact of contagion forcing the instant shutdown of all of their buildings. So how did they cope? Well, in many cases, actually remarkably well. Educators are very resourceful and dedicated to their cause. So as soon as they realised the pandemic was an existential threat to their children's education, teachers everywhere began to reorganise and leverage new tools. The impact on the pace of innovation was immediate and dramatic. That impact on education can be broken down into three phases. The first phase, between March and June, was when educators were confronted with the sudden lockdown. And that was real crisis management. Initially, it was hoped this might just last a few weeks, but for many it became clear that there would be no going back until after the summer. So that meant classes had to be provided remotely, and assessments and graduation and a whole bunch of other processes completely rethought. In that first 3 months, all energies went into completing the school year. Everything else had to wait. Technology played a critical role at this time as educators scrambled to leverage video conferencing and cloud applications, online learning, and the students' own devices. What's fascinating is that these technologies were not widely available until really quite recently. Most of us now take smartphones and cameras, Wi-Fi, and broadband internet for granted. But if COVID-19 had happened just a few short years ago, the available options would have been far more limited. That then provides the first indication as to why these changes may not be temporary. I call the second stage of the pandemic response emergency planning. By June, the scientists were telling us that the pandemic would not be over until at least 2021, and that meant a radical new back-to-school plan was required. Again, the response of the education sector was quite impressive. For example, by mid-August, all 60 school districts here in British Columbia had submitted their back-to-school plans covering 1,650 public schools, 600,000 plus students and over 50,000 staff, spread over an area twice the size of Britain. As a grateful parent, I've been really impressed by the dedication and adaptability of educators and administrators in schools and in universities. They not only successfully completed the last school year, but they also resolved the huge problems of social distancing for students of all ages this year. That's a huge accomplishment. So now we're entering the third phase of the response, which I'll call looking ahead. This stage will likely last 12 months from now until the beginning of the new school year in September 2021. Hopefully by that time the pandemic will be mostly behind us. While this school year will look quite different, most of the operational decisions have already been made and parents have been informed. The teachers and students are off and running with their new classes. So having dealt with the initial crisis management and then the emergency planning, educational leaders are now free to turn their attentions to the longer term issues. So now then is a period for reflecting on what just happened and deciding what the future might look like. As they do so, many leaders will conclude that a return to the previous status quo is not the right approach. Many of the lessons that have been learnt and too many advancements been made and too many opportunities have been uncovered. So what happens now? So Winston Churchill once famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Looking at this crisis through that lens is not to underestimate the huge humanitarian toll of this pandemic, but rather it underscores the importance of rebirth and rejuvenation. Leaders in education face a choice. Do they return back to the status quo? Do they maybe consolidate the changes they've already made? Or do they continue to accelerate the pace of the change process? Momentum is key. So many leaders will conclude it's better to ride the momentum that's already been generated. The issue, of course, then, is change to what? To answer that question, leaders first have to reflect on where the organisation is today. For many, their existing goals to modernise learning experiences will remain constant. So their previously held objectives, such as ensuring equality, increasing the focus on core competencies, and personalising learning and equipping young people with future-ready skills, and ultimately developing them into lifelong learners, these are all still valid. And most of the knowledge and technology available to support changes already exists. So what's changed here is not the technology, but the environment for change itself. Many of the barriers that have hampered substantive changes being made to the learning delivery models have now been removed. In fact, most stakeholders, the teachers, the parents, and especially the students, have got no desire to resurrect them at all. And many of those that had previously resisted changes may now be the ones that are the strongest advocates for it. So simply put, expectations have shifted completely, and it's that shift in expectations that opens up what may be the most compelling opportunity for learning innovation in living memory, to move to a hybrid delivery model for education. So let's consider what that might mean. The very first place to start is to think about the impacts on those students most negatively impacted by the pandemic. Let's think about those underprivileged students whose families maybe can't afford online access, or vulnerable students living in unsafe environments where school may be a sanctuary. There's special needs students who are dependent on personal support, and students with high anxiety or other emotional needs that may have been exacerbated by COVID-19. And then, of course, there's students living in remote communities where the impact of socialisation may have been even more acute. Any plan for change that doesn't prioritise support for these vulnerable groups may actually increase the gap between the haves and the have-nots in our society. So learning modernisation plans in a post-COVID world must first incorporate the core principles of equity, access, safety and support for all students. There's a unique chance here to close the gaps in individual opportunity that are still way too prevalent in our society. Another core input for consideration is what the students themselves want, or maybe more accurately, what they don't want. There's been several studies on this topic already, and 4 things stand out consistently that the majority of students do not want. Number 1, they don't want to learn alone. Number 2, they don't want to be taught by a computer, no matter how smart. Number 3, they don't want to follow rigid, inflexible learning structures. And 4th, they don't want to sit in front of a computer all day. Students are telling us that they absolutely do want to leverage new technologies, but they see those technologies as an enhancement to their learning experience, not a replacement. This confirms what most of us already knew intuitively, that the student-teacher relationship will continue to be central to everything. But the method of how the interaction between students and teachers happens may have to evolve. The widespread adoption of new communications and collaboration tools into learning experiences has major implications for the teaching profession. Teachers will need to become more adept in providing group cohesion and support that's needed in remote and hybrid learning scenarios. So the educators themselves will need to be supported as their traditional role and skills evolve, and they become more mentors and facilitators, while the students will have to learn to participate more directly in determining their own personalised learning experience. Change is always complex, and leading a digitally transformative change can be really daunting. So where should leaders start? So having evaluated where the organisation is today, the first thing to do is to define the destination. While a major modernisation programme will undoubtedly involve substantive overhaul of technologies and skills and process, all of that needs clear direction first. And by that I mean a written, concise and well understood strategy and plan, developed by the entire leadership team that encapsulates the organisational vision, goals and objectives. Out of the start of any digital transformation program, Fujitsu begins by working with the leadership team to quickly establish the business goals in clear and unambiguous terms. This process, which we describe simply as getting ready, is critical to preparing the organisation for change. It's the foundation for any successful modernisation program. Moving ahead, it's not possible for any organisation to go from steady state to complete reinvention in one step. That's going to take time. But clients will want to see progress and results quickly. So the second stage focuses on transforming the existing organisation. So that means making changes that produce genuine and very tangible improvements, but are also not so ambitious as to create confusion and despondency. While the pace of change has undoubtedly been accelerated by the pandemic, let's not forget that education is still a very complex business, and meaningful change will still take time. Education is also a people-focused business, and there are only so many processes and technologies that teachers and parents and even the students themselves can cope with. So this stage focuses on optimizing existing resources while also showcasing the potential for the future. Digital transformation, though, is ultimately about changing the customer experience. And in this case, that means changing the student experience. So longer term, the goal may be to evolve the organisation towards an as yet to be determined learning model. It's going to take experimentation and experience as well as further innovation. So very few policymakers, institutional leaders, educators and parents are now doubting the need for change, nor will they begrudge the impacts and costs. Education simply matters too much to all of us. But COVID-19 means a collapse of the timeline from what might have taken a whole generation to a much faster transformation. I'm sure education 10 years from now will look quite different. How it's different, it remains to be seen. But what is clear is that we've seen the art of the possible in education as a side effect of this pandemic. And as we've done so, our expectations have been radically altered. There's no going back. The move to hybrid delivery of education is already now underway. The key now is to lead that change. In terms of what Fujitsu can do, I must first emphasize that we are not pedagogic specialists. We leave that to the real experts. What we can do is help guide digital transformation and support the transition to next generation technologies. As well as facilitating workshops and research to help leaders shape tomorrow, Fujitsu can support several streams of activity during the transformation process. First of all, the cloud. Most educational organisations have completely underinvested in their IT infrastructure for a long time. So the existing legacy systems are a barrier to innovation. Migrating these to a modern, safe, reliable and actually relatively cheap cloud environments with virtually unlimited capacity will open up a whole bunch of opportunity. This is the essential to any digital modernisation. Second area is providing equal access to all. So if students don't have access to technology resources that are their gateway to remote and online learning, communication and all the other collaboration tools, then they quickly become disenfranchised. So ensuring students have equitable access to devices is laudable, but buying devices is really an outdated approach. Buying hardware results in incurring a major support liability, and staff and students may need different devices at different times. So instead, our forward clients are moving towards device as a service, where Fujitsu manages the supply and maintenance, the support and the upgrade, and even the disposal of those devices on their behalf. Fujitsu is then responsible for tracking and repurposing all devices according to user needs. The third area is user applications. And like the underlying infrastructure, many of the applications in education are unfortunately way out of date. And they're costly to maintain, and they become impediments to growth. But it's difficult to determine what's needed and what's not. So to help our clients with this, we use our application valuation assessment methodology to provide an objective and accurate review of all of the existing applications and their relative value to the organisation, together with detailed recommendations on what to replace, what to replatform, what to refactor, or what to retire, and also highlight any gaps. The outcome is a detailed application portfolio plan with clearly defined priorities and budgets to realign your applications with your business strategy. And finally, we have the people. No change program is effective without a comprehensive change management plan. So we use tools such as results chain analysis, organisational behaviour reviews, readiness surveys, and sustainment plans to guide the process and provide a plan that can be embraced and supported by all staff. So as education leaders consider their organisation's future in a post-COVID world, here's some closing thoughts. Consider that this pandemic, as tragic as it's been, presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to effect a substantial, system-wide change. The pace of innovation is already accelerated, so what's needed now is a long-term strategy and plan to manage that transformation. The overall objectives may be similar, but the transformation journey is going to be very different than it was only a few short months ago. New hybrid learning models have arrived, and with those become new expectations. For more personalised learning, for better communications technology, and for more equitable access. And finally, for much greater collaboration between the teachers, the students, and their parents. As such, technology can no longer be considered a separate department or a head office function. Technology is becoming as fundamental to the infrastructure as the building. It has the capacity to extend and indeed reshape the classroom forever. Teachers everywhere are now widely embracing these technologies to help them do what they do best, which is changing student learning outcomes one person at a time. The 2020s will be a demanding but very exciting time to be a leader in education. There will never be a better opportunity for change. The question now is whether you're ready to start reimagining education in a post-COVID world. Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about Fujitsu Education Services, then please contact me at simon.blythe@fujitsu.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn. I look forward to continuing the conversation.